All right. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you on this beautiful November day. My name is Rachel Paletti, and today I'm going to chat with you a little bit about strategic academic planning. We'll kind of dive into the nitty gritty of what that means, but this session will hopefully provide a little bit of a roadmap for you as you start to think about how to really optimize your academic offerings so that you're consistently responsive to the market, to your student needs, to your student outcomes, and also meeting the needs and expectations of your faculty and staff. Before we get into this, I just want to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. As I mentioned, my name is Rachel, and I lead the firm's higher education consulting practice. I work with clients on a number of things. Most relevant to this conversation is that I work with clients pretty closely using our program economic analysis tool. And many of those clients are sort of consistently going through some form of a program review, whether it's with purely financial metrics or with other metrics. And so we're really going to lean into that process today and chat a little bit about how we can leverage tools and data, as well as wrap people and process around those data to create a more sustainable program review process. As a consultant, I have a fair amount of experience in this sort of academic review. But I was also a full-time faculty member at a small nonprofit institution for 10 years and have pretty good insight into what it's like to be a faculty member on the other side of this program review. I chaired both our faculty standards and our curriculum committee, as well as being the program coordinator for two of our big programs. So I certainly understand, I think, what some of the best practices are for engaging what we think are your best assets, your faculty and staff, in doing a program review. So as we move through today, I want us to keep a couple things in mind. We're going to, first of all, make the case that the traditional ad hoc program review process that we've seen kind of take place across higher ed over the last 10 or so years is problematic. It's challenging, and it's not particularly sustainable. We'll also, of course, make what we think is the most compelling argument is that some program reviews, while necessary, are not particularly strategic. And so what we really want to focus on today is how to wrap really strategic planning principles around the program review so that it is sustainable and actually gets you the outcomes that you're looking for. And so a lot of our conversation today is going to focus on things like what sorts of data that you need to use, where you can find these data, and really trying to make the case that all the data points that you use in a program review or in creating what we want to call a strategic academic plan should really identify past contributions of your programs, present state, and future potential of all of your existing and potential new programs. And then finally, we want to cap off with some best practices, which are really going to revolve around making sure that you have the right people at the table and that you have a process that's going to allow you to sustain your strategic academic plan into the near future. And then, as always, we'll conclude with some kind of tips from the field. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of resources that we've made available, and those resources will be available in this slide deck should you decide that you want to take it with you. But we have a couple different options for finding out more information after this presentation. We have a three-part article series that is really going to sort of dive into a lot of the content that we're making today, or a lot of the content that we're speaking about today that you can go ahead and click on, download, however you see fit. We have information about some of the tools that we're referencing here in the presentation available as well. And then finally, one of the things that we're most excited about right now is if you find that today is particularly helpful, I would encourage you to look into our complimentary faculty financial literacy training. We are right now very committed to helping you bring those best assets to the table to have these conversations. And we find that to do that, it often requires that your faculty and staff have a strong understanding of the higher ed finance model. So if you're so inclined, we're happy to come to your institution remotely and discuss Higher Ed Finance 101 so that you can really get everyone kind of rowing in the same direction if they aren't already. So feel free to take advantage of those resources now or throughout the presentation. So let's dig in here. We, of course, being plugged into the industry here at Forvis Mazars, have seen quite a bit of changes and evolution in the operating environment for higher ed, and these will be no secret to anyone in the room. As of 2024, Inside Higher Education is reporting that 51% of business officers in private higher education are reporting budget deficits for this year. And to the point that I made earlier, many of those business officers and the provosts that sit on their teams kind of recognize that it can be challenging to bring everyone to the table to have conversation about strategic actions that they can take, simply because there's some fundamental misunderstanding about the higher ed finance model. And so what tends to happen in these situations is that there's a real attempt to cut budgets through things like a program review, which we'll dive into in a little bit. You'll probably recognize some of these headlines. This challenge is affecting not just private higher education, but also some of the large flagship institutions across the state. And it's not surprising. Enrollment growth is inconsistent and probably bifurcated in that kind of the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Expenses have grown, as we all know. There's also increasing regulation on the sector, which comes with significant expense, as well as changing expectations from students and families about the sorts of resources that institutions will provide to students on campuses, which also come with significant expense. And to wrap all of this around, as we all know, the higher education governance model is unique relative to other industries. And this can sometimes make cost management difficult depending on how the governance structure is set up at your institution. So we'll dig into our first polling question here, just so I can get a sense of kind of where everyone stands with this. I want to know whether your institution has attempted to conduct some kind of program review in order to address a budget deficit or find savings. And I'll give you a little bit of time to answer this question. Okay. So go ahead and answer that question, and we'll see what the responses look like as we come in. Okay. So there's some mixed responses here. Interestingly, about 47% of us are saying, yes, we have attempted to conduct some kind of program review, this content, about 16% saying no, and then about a third of the audience isn't really sure whether a program review has been conducted. And that's going to speak to one of the main points of this presentation, which is that these efforts tend to happen in silos, which can be unproductive. So the solution to these budget deficits has for some time now been what goes by many names. We'll call it a program review, an optimization. Sometimes these reviews extend beyond the academic operation and move into the auxiliary and administrative functions. But overall, when we talk about a program review in this context, we're talking typically about a one-time ad hoc evaluation of all academic programs. And typically the goal of such a program review is to sunset programs and typically separate with the faculty and staff and students sitting in those programs to address those budget deficits. And that, as you can imagine, can be particularly painful, not just because it tends to be a rather long process, but that it's very difficult to reach consensus about which of our coworkers we're going to separate with. And I will say just there is very little evidence that this approach actually accomplishes those goals. Certainly, we've seen institutions that have done program reviews that have been able to recover financially, but the effectiveness overall is mixed. And the effectiveness of this kind of program review probably depends deeply on the data that are used and the people and process that are wrapped around those data, which is, again, going to be one of the big talking points for this particular webinar. And I would just argue that typically program reviews are really more tactical and not particularly strategic. And here's why I say that. Unlike more strategic actions, program reviews tend to be reactive. So they tend to come after several years of budget deficits where there doesn't seem to be any other action we can take. So they're not particularly proactive. And this is going to have implications because it means that by design or by definition, they're not necessarily looking to the future. I would also say, and I'll make this case pretty quickly here, that one of the challenges that probably limits the effectiveness of this process at some institutions is that program reviews, by any definition or in any context, tend to follow the organizational chart, which means that all data gathering and interpretation tends to occur in these unproductive silos. For those of you who have had conversations with your faculty and staff, and especially if you're here representing the academic affairs or if you're a chief academic officer, I think what you'll find and can probably relate to is that the program review really violates expectations around what our faculty expect out of employment in higher ed. And this is because it's how the industry has been set up for a very long time. As someone who had a very traditional route through a PhD program, I can say definitively that there is an expectation. You get a PhD, you work really hard until you get tenure, and then you have a job for the foreseeable future until you don't want a job at that institution anymore. So the concept that your position can be eliminated because of budgets that you perceive as out of your control really violates expectations. And then on top of that, there's also very little technical preparation for a program review. In other words, most people simply are not equipped with the knowledge of higher ed finance to move through that process swiftly and competently. And then going back to my argument about proactivity, program reviews like the ones that we're describing here typically are not vision driven. And that's because they are not necessarily focused on gaining a long-term advantage in the market, which is the definition of strategy. And so what we want to do is make the case that a strategic planning approach addresses these challenges. And we'll tell you how to do that as we move forward. So just want to double down or sort of drill in a little deeper to some of the challenges that we see with the program review to make this case. The typical program review, is in the one that we're seeing kind of splash all over the headlines, tends to follow the organizational chart. So this is typically a process that is mandated by the president or board, but then the process tends to be delegated down to a chief academic officer who typically has faculty and IR reporting to them, a chief financial officer who is really dealing with financial analysts and controllers. And then there's typically someone from enrollment management or marketing involved in this process. What I want to really emphasize here is that this approach is how we operate, but it's not necessarily how we should strategize. So there are different motivations and different goals for each of these groups. That's precisely why we typically recommend, and why it's sort of industry standard, to create an inclusive program review committee so that all of those goals and motivations are taken into account. But at the end of the day, those motivations, those differing motivations and goals ultimately can lead to a lack of consensus and a lack of clear outcomes unless there's a real strategic vision behind this process. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by that. If you think about what a program review has looked like on your campus, and you think about these primary decision makers at the cabinet level, program reviews are typically conducted by academic affairs on a semi-regular basis, if not annual, maybe every 5 years or 7 years. And the motive for that kind of program review is typically because it's required or expected by accreditors. And the goals for that kind of program review are understandably to demonstrate rigor and quality. Okay, the data sources tend to focus explicitly on planned assessments of learning outcomes. And because of that, blind spots, and the academic office is not the only office that typically has blind spots. And frankly, the chief academic officer may not have this blind spot, but many of the faculty and staff operating in our academic programs are simply not kept abreast of the revenues and expenses that are attributed to their specific program. And for that reason, much of the review that we do in academic affairs is really focused on demonstrating past rigor. Now, the finance office is typically motivated to balance the budget and maybe even generate a little bit of margin for the institution. So their goal is typically to identify bloated expenses. And because of this, the data that they're working from are typically focused on the general ledger, maybe the financial statements. And I don't want to suggest that finance officers are typically unaware of an institution's mission, because they are typically plugged into a strategic plan or the general mission for the institution. But the focus on present state of academic programs can sometimes obscure the role that those academic programs play in the overall mission of the institution. And then finally, we can't forget about our enrollment management folks, who are charged with identifying growth opportunities and then creating a pipeline of students around those opportunities. So their goal is to build enrollment and probably to build brand as well. And this means that they're primarily relying on external data like market research, market insights, external data points, et cetera. And so their blind spots might be around, do we have the right people in place to launch this new program? Do we have the right resources to launch this new program? If we do launch this program, can we offer a curriculum that is actually going to meet students' needs in the employment market? And so because of these differing foci, the motivations tend to produce a focus on different time points. Okay, and you can see those time points laid out here. At the end of the day, though, there is real concern that a focus too much on the past, too much on the present, and to some extent too much on the future really prevents us from making particularly strategic decisions. And if you've ever been involved in a strategic planning process, you know that a typical strategic planning process is going to harvest as much data as we can find, make a real attempt to achieve consensus around what our strategic initiatives are, and make sure that those strategic initiatives are focused on where we're headed next. And there are some flaws in many strategic planning processes that I'll address in just a minute that we don't want to replicate here. So as I alluded to earlier, these motivations, differing motivations, don't just require us to focus on separate time points, but they also can sometimes lead to a real lack of consensus about what our strategic actions on the academic side should be. So we can very quickly get to a point where it's difficult to reach consensus. And there are some real action steps that you can take, we'll call them low-hanging fruit, if you will, at your institution to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row before you even attempt to reach that consensus. And we're going to focus on that in just a little bit. So I want us to reimagine the program review through a strategic planning perspective. Okay, so this is applying strategic planning to your academic offerings. And that's why we call it a strategic academic plan. Most of your institutions probably have a strategic plan. It may or may not serve as the North Star operations or for what sort of initiatives you're undertaking and prioritizing. What I want to really emphasize is that your approach to your academic portfolio should really be strategic. And it should really be documented in a way that allows you to follow it through. It should really be aligned with the institution's overall resources and overall priorities. So you can see our approach to strategic planning here, enterprise-wide or institution-wide strategic planning here, is really coming in 4 phases. Okay, so the first is discovery, which is that finding as much data as you can find. And again, I want to emphasize that your data really need to be focused on past, present, and future contributions of academic programs. It's the only way to really get a comprehensive picture of everything that a program is contributing to the institution. Of course, this is also where you'll really start to think about what our institutional culture has been, what our mission is, and how we're going to build an academic portfolio that wraps around those things strategically. I would also say, and this is one thing that can be missing even in an institution-wide strategic planning process, is a real case for visioning. So getting people excited about the future and what we could accomplish. A true visioning process allows you to kind of think without constraints. And there are a lot of different models and tools in the market. There are a lot of really strong facilitators who are great at getting people to think aspirationally like this. But at the end of the day, visioning is future minded. And it's one thing that tends to be missing from a lot of our program review process. The next step in a typical strategic planning process that we argue has to be implemented for your academic programs is prioritization. So you have to understand, okay, we have this vision for the future. We know that that vision is aligned with our data and our mission. Now we probably have to go in, put pen to paper, and figure out exactly which of these things we can do when. So is this a program that is going to take 3 years to launch? If so, because it's expensive or because we would have to hire a bunch of new people, new equipment, is a program that's going to take you 3 years to launch going to still be feasible and sustainable 3 years from now? Those are the sorts of things and conversations that need to happen when we prioritize. And then I would also just say that having real structure around this, like these are the things that we can do with our existing programs in the next academic year. And these are the things that we can do with potential new programs in the next academic year, and so on and so forth. And I'll show you an example of what some outcomes of that process might look like later on in the talk. But finally, implementation is extremely important. So as you know, again, if you've ever been involved in an institution-wide strategic planning process, one of the biggest challenges with those processes, and we've written about this at the firm as well, you can take a look at our foresight to see what we've written about this. many strategic plans sit on the shelf, as in they're pretty, they're a great document, nothing ever gets done with them. And there are probably a lot of reasons for that. But one of those reasons is that there has to be a final step of implementation planning, as in there has to be real intentionality and accountability around the strategic initiatives that were developed during prioritization. And this is going to mean that there has to be an ongoing effort to refresh what's going on in your institution so that it's consistently responsive to the environment. And I would argue one of the reasons why institution-wide strategic plans sometimes don't get carried out is because they are written for a 7 or 10-year period, and the operating environment can change significantly, sometimes in ways that we have very little control over, that renders a strategic plan moot. So it's really, really, really important that this be something that is done on a regular basis. I will make the case that it should be done annually, best at your institution. Okay. So as we get into this next piece here, I want to really provide some concrete suggestions about what sorts of data you should be bringing to a strategic academic plan. And we're going to use that term rather than program review moving forward. Which of the following buckets is most important for a strategic approach? Okay. And this is going to be difficult, and it's designed to be difficult, and I'll explain why in just a second. But are you focusing on academic data? Are you focusing on more economic or financial data, enrollment management, sort of marketing data? Or are you focusing more on institutional data, okay, such as how a program serves the institution overall? Okay. And while if your things are coming to mind, if questions pop into your head, feel free to just throw them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer them as we move forward. Okay, so interesting, I guess interesting, but not particularly surprising results here. We have about 18% of our attendees saying that academic data is most important for a strategic approach. A similar amount saying enrollment management, a fair amount, unsurprisingly, given our typical audience, focusing on economics or finance, and then the other quarter or so focusing on institutional data. So part of the reason why this might have been difficult to answer, there's really two reasons. One, you might not have a strong operational definition of what each one of these things are. And two, these are probably not mutually exclusive. And so I really want to make the case that you should be looking at all of these data for a strategic approach. Okay, so I want to leave this up for a little bit. Feel free to take a picture. Remember, the slides will be available to you, and we also have a piece that's linked in your there on On24 for you that focuses on sort of finding the right data. I want to go back to this concept of past, present, and future performance. Really, every single one of these data buckets is capable of taking a past, present, and future lens. So certainly on the academic side, we always want to make sure that we're focusing on student outcomes. Our graduates and our alumni are our best marketers, as in if they are successful, it's much easier for us to make the case that our prospects will be successful and our first-year students will be successful. There's a lot of different ways to define and operationalize student outcomes. I will say from experience that having been involved and facilitated these processes around program review in particular is that it can take a long time to define what we mean by student outcomes and what metrics we think are acceptable. There's probably some things we could do to cut down on that time, but one thing I will emphasize is that strategy is a long-range vision for the future. That does not mean that strategy is carried out as slow as possible, okay? So there's a difference between playing the long game and dragging our heels. So as we start to think through operationalizing these different metrics, it's very important that we have people and process, which we'll describe in just a minute, that will help us move through this process swiftly and reach some consensus swiftly. Of course, things like faculty activities are particularly important. Faculty, especially if they're bringing in grant funding or are particularly adept at bringing in students or external partnerships, can really, really, really serve the institution well, even outside of their very valuable role in the classroom. I would also say just think about whether your programs are cross-serving. So what happens if you eliminate your English department? Does that have a strong effect on your general education curriculum, or does it have a strong effect on gender studies program that you've decided to keep, or does it have a strong effect on your history department? Okay, think through about feeder and catcher programs. So are there programs that are bringing in students to the institution, and are there programs that are keeping students from leaving? As in, if your biology program has a really low retention rate because they tend to be particularly rigorous, are there programs at your institution that are catching those students so that they don't leave? Those are important programs as well. And then taking a future-minded approach in the academic space is, what is our capacity and bandwidth moving forward to expand? Okay, so where do we have empty seats? Can those seats be filled? And of course, that will require partnership with enrollment management to really understand whether those seats can be filled or if there are creative ways to fill them. Enrollment management data is probably the most explicitly future-minded because they tend to be looking at market research, employer data, employer wants and needs. So if there's an advisory group or a real system you have in place for getting employer input, that would be great data to bring to this process. I would also say your applications and your yield rate are particularly important, and that's by program. All of these data are individually by program. Many institutions know their overall yield rate. Let's say that it's 20% of students who are accepted come to the institution. You really got to peek under the hood a little bit and see, well, are there some programs where the yield is 60% and other programs where the yield is 10%? If you have programs where the yield is 60%, it probably indicates that that program has a particularly strong reputation, or that there's very little competition for that program in the market among your competitors. And those are things to really pay attention to. And then also demand, which can be subjective or objective, what students want to study versus what the employment market is asking them to study is really what I'm getting at there. Most of you are familiar with the economic metrics that are going to be particularly important here. We've been making the case for a very long time, and to some success with many institutions, that looking at margins generated by your academic programs or subject areas, even all the way down to the course level, can be really helpful in terms of making operational decisions. But it can also be helpful just in helping you determine what the long-term viability of a program is. Okay, and once you know what the margins of your academic programs are, make sure you really understand the drivers of those. Is it class size? Is it the fact that the faculty sitting in this program are particularly expensive? Is it that enrollment has been on the decline? Is it that enrollment has been steady, but expenses in this program are increasing? Those are all the questions that you probably need to ask when you're taking a look at economic data. And then finally, I really can't emphasize this enough, that the academic portfolio should really align with the institution's overall goals and strategy. This is important because it means that the ideal portfolio is going to be different for every institution. Like I said, we work closely with a lot of clients who are evaluating academic programs, who are thinking about launching new programs. And this isn't always intuitive. There might be a nationwide or even a statewide employment market for some particular program. But if your institution's culture, values, mission would not support the learning outcomes of that program, then it's probably not going to be a great program, given that you might have trouble carrying it out, or that you might have trouble attracting students who want that program. A good example of this that I heard recently is launching a hospitality management program. There's a market for it in this particular area of the country, but the institution that launched that program is an institution that, because of their mission, is particularly averse to talking about serving things like alcohol. And because of that, they had trouble attracting students, and they also had trouble implementing the program with the learning outcomes that students might expect from a hospitality management program. And so even if there was an employment market for it, it's not a good fit. And that mission fit is going to be particularly helpful as you think about launching new programs. And then, of course, there's just overall alignment with resources and the potential for alumni engagement. Those of you who are kind of on the ground working through your budgets right now probably know that in many cases, a well thought out capital campaign is where institutions are really focusing a lot of their resources right now. But if you have programs that are particularly strong at engaging alumni, it probably increases their chance of giving moving forward. Okay, so just real quick on the margin driver, the margin analysis issue. We've had a tool in the market for a long time. I would be remiss if I didn't call it out. This tool is called Program Economic Analysis, and if you want more information about this tool, you can click on the link there in your resources, or we'll have a question at the end asking if anyone wants more information. Program Economic Analysis is an integral part of strategic academic planning. I hope that the previous slide made it clear that strategic academic planning involves all sorts of data that have on their face very little to do with the finances. But at minimum, we would make the case that institutions need to probably understand the financial picture of their academic programs, in addition to understanding all of that other information. Okay. So I would also say one of the big things that you probably need to be mindful of moving forward is if you're thinking about launching new programs, and a good strategic academic plan should focus on new programs, make sure that you're collecting all of those same data points. Know whether a program can cross-serve. Know whether you have capacity and bandwidth to launch a new program. Bonus points if you can launch a program that has strong demand that won't require you to go and hire a bunch of new resources to meet the demands of that program. And also, make sure the program is aligned with your existing resources. Depending on the size and scope of a new program, it can have all sorts of implications for your statement of activities, including what kind of tuition revenue it's going to bring, what kind of discount rate it's going to require, what sorts of gifts a program might be able to bring in, even if they're restrictive gifts that allow you to operate that program. Are there specific pieces, big capital outlays you're going to have to make to launch this program? Well, if so, you want to make sure that those are kind of worth the squeeze, given how long it might take you to build enrollment in that program. Okay, so use a good tool, including a strong 10-year forecast financial management tool like the one we offer in partnership with Scenario, to really identify what some of these strategic moves should be. For instance, what should your discount rate look like in years 1 through 3? Well, it should probably be a little higher. But maybe by years 4 and 6, you can dial that discount rate back once you build up adequate demand and resources for the program. Okay? So as you move forward, here's just some quick tips from the field before we dive into people and process around this issue. You have to find a way to use these data productively. We can collect data till we're blue in the face, and I'm sure many of you have heard at your institutions, we want to be more data-driven, we want to make sound data decisions. Well, until those data are actually aggregated and visualized in a way that people can internalize, it becomes very difficult to use them the way that we kind of need to use them. So first of all, spend time to operationalize your variables and agree to those definitions. Okay, so what does it mean to say that a program has strong student outcomes? Is it that there's a high graduation rate from this program? Is it that students are employed within 6 months of graduation? Is it that 5 years after graduation, students are licensed in their professional area? Is it that 5 years after graduation, students are making more than the median for the state? Okay, there's all sorts of things that we could sort of dig into with regard to student outcomes. But whatever you do, avoid the temptation to focus only on past success. Past success is useful for things like forecasting, but it is not always useful in terms of understanding what kind of disruptions are going to happen in the industry and what employers might be asking from students in the near future, especially when we have things like AI and other disruptive technologies affecting what employers are asking for. Okay? Also, establish that consensus with cabinet members. This is not to say that cabinet members should be the only ones at the table, but cabinet all needs to be on the same page about what these data mean and what we're going to do with them. I work with cabinets a lot. There are real things that cabinets can do to kind of come together and reach consensus about how we're going to move forward. Okay? After you have the data, visualize those data and put them in some sort of transparent data dashboard or platform. I see a lot of institutions do sort of accreditation-focused program reviews. those program reviews are almost never made transparent to faculty members outside of those programs. And therefore, it becomes even harder for people to understand where our portfolio is doing well and where it's not doing well. There's more on this later, but of course, we really have to focus on data hygiene before we can dive into any kind of visualization. And there are plenty of good tools to help you with that. And then make sure that you're benchmarking, as always, not just benchmarking against the environment and relative to the field, but understand yourself. What are the trends? Looking at 1 year of data is not really ever going to give you what you need. You probably need to look at things like 3 and 4, 5, maybe even 7 years worth of data to really understand the trends and be able to explain any little blips that might occur. There's a quick question in the chat. Yes, the entire session will be recorded and archived on our webinar. Finally, make sure you build a scorecard and track that each year. It's not enough to just say, okay, this program went through a review. You have to now say, okay, well, because of 4 or 5 years worth of data now, we're confident that this program is doing well and that it can pretty much maintain its current course to continue doing well. That would be a green program. A program that has really started to slide in terms of enrollment while expenses increased, well, that program might fit in a yellow, okay? And that says, that sort of middle ground says, okay, the program is fine for now, but there's probably a couple changes we need to make. And then lastly, you want to make sure that that scorecard really gives you a sense of which programs need to be put on some sort of 3-year remediation plan so that they get the most help and the most attention to help them recover, okay, before there's a conversation about sunsetting. Okay? So in our remaining time together, limitations of an institution-wide strategic planning process might ultimately hold us up here, okay? So some potential pitfalls of strategic planning apply to academics. Too many cooks in the kitchen, okay? No awareness of resources, some apathy, and then potentially the potential for identity or reputation to limit innovative approaches. Okay. And not surprisingly, we have basically the field is pretty split, and you guys were allowed to select all that apply. Many of you probably rightly indicated that these are all limitations of a traditional strategic planning process. So what I want to do as we move forward with the rest of our talk here is give you some quick actionable tips to make sure that that your institution doesn't realize those same limitations. Okay? Typical planning pitfalls at the institution-wide level, and certainly for the academic portfolio, is that sometimes we try to be everything to everyone, okay? And this is one of the outcomes sometimes of an extremely inclusive process, is that everyone weighs in. We try our best to sort of meet the needs of every stakeholder group or every constituency, even when we lack the resources to do so. So in addition to that visioning session, which will allow people to really imagine the future, you also have to go through that prioritization process where you say, okay, this is what we have resources and time to do in the next year, next 3 years, next 5 years, and then continuously refreshing that. You want to make sure that this is not independent of your budget process. You want to be sure that this is something you're doing probably annually. You do not want your strategic academic plan to be something that's built once and then never realized because no one looks at it again. And then I cannot stress this enough. Your strategic academic plan should not overemphasize what has worked well in the past. Certainly past contributions play a strong role because they tend to speak really well to the programs that hold up our mission and that have contributed to our reputation to date. But a program having done well revenue-wise or enrollment-wise in the past is not alone justification to continue throwing resources at that program, okay? So as we prioritize sort of where our portfolio is going, think through all of these things, okay? So we recommend a cyclical process, okay? And there are a lot of different ways to envision this. This is just one kind of model for how this could work. The process should be annual. I guess every 2 years at minimum. It should touch every program and monitor trends. So it's really important to note that you might not see movement in a program over 1 year, but you might start to see movement in that program over 3 or 4 years. And you might say, okay, well, why can't we just do this process every 3 or 4 years? The answer to that is that movements in programs don't happen simultaneously or concurrently. Trends in program A will occur at different time points than trends in program B. And if you're only doing the whole process every 4 or 5 years, you're going to miss trends and get to them much later than you would have been able to address them before. Make sure you have policies for addressing low-performing programs. I recommend a remediation protocol. So you have specific metrics that trigger a program going into the red. Those programs are probably programs where enrollment is declining. There's very little collaboration between those programs and other programs at the institution. There's very little alumni engagement, expenses are going up, and there's very little market demand. So those policies should be written, they should be transparent. And I think most importantly is that if you have programs that are in the red, a strategic academic planning process will allow you time and space to dedicate resources to those programs recovering. A program being in the red does not mean that it needs to be cut today. It does mean that if it still looks like this 2 to 3 years from now, it might not be something we should be prioritizing. So what I want to emphasize is that taking this intentional, codified approach to program prioritization allows you to be proactive so that you're not constantly reacting, cutting faculty and staff because they're sort of too far along in the red to have helped the program. And then, of course, make sure that you're aware of your academic calendar. When I was a faculty member, if we wanted to make changes to next year's academic calendar or catalog or programs, those changes had to be in and approved by the previous October. So that meant almost a 10-month-long lead up to a new program launching. So make sure that you are aware of those constraints, recognizing that they are not particularly easy to circumvent. Okay, some important questions for you, and I'll just leave this here for you to think about a little bit. Who is going to kick off this process? And maybe a better way to think about that is who is responsible for saying, all right, guys, we need to start doing strategic academic planning. If you're in the room, it may be you. If you are in the room and it's not you, I would strongly encourage you to think about engaging whoever that is to start realizing this process, okay? And really start to think about what it's going to look like. Who's going to pull the data? Who's going to visualize the data? So who's going to be responsible for making that transparent dashboard? What is this cross-functional team going to look like? There is absolutely nothing today that should be interpreted to mean that this shouldn't be an inclusive process. However, it probably does need to engage specific people from the academic side of the house, specific people from finance, specific people from enrollment management, probably specific people from student affairs too. So put some thought to who those specific people should be, and they will not necessarily be the same people that raise their hand and volunteer for this process. Okay? Who should lead? And then finally, if this is an annual process that follows really strong policies and carries them out, well, does that imply that this should be a standing committee? Okay, many institutions have a standing program review committee. That program review committee typically is not charged with saying green, yellow, red programs. Okay, so they're not typically charged with identifying programs that need improvement, at least not in a comprehensive way. And so is this committee elected or appointed? How long are the terms? Keeping in mind that there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve here, right? So if you're on one-year terms, it might mean that people take just as long to learn this process and then they're rolling off. What sorts of policies is this committee going to follow? And if you're thinking about establishing a standing committee, which I would argue is the most sustainable process, well, someone has to write those policies. So thinking about accountability, okay? I am a big fan of the combination of autonomy and accountability in higher ed. As someone who has worked in several different positions across this industry and held roles from different perspectives, I would say that it's very easy to grant autonomy to people working at our institutions. It's not as easy to hold them accountable. And this goes back to the importance of policies. So know your goals and make them known so that people can be held to those standards. Make sure that there's a champion for each initiative. I'll show you a little bit about what some of this means. make sure that you are not afraid to revisit an earlier decision. Something you said 3 years ago or some decision you landed on 3 years ago may just not be sustainable now. So make sure that you're constantly revisiting and refreshing those data. Okay. When I say know your goals, what I typically mean is, why are you embarking on this process in the first place? Okay. Is it to go from budget deficit to budget neutral? Good. Well, then the entire process should be focused on helping you find a balanced budget year over year over year over year, not just this year, but every year thereafter. Okay. And best practice wise, your goal probably shouldn't be budget neutral. It should probably be to generate slight margin. Okay. And in order to do that, if your goal is a financial one, which for many of us it is, you need to know what kind of margin your academic programs have to generate, given that your academic portfolio is responsible for many of you for a lot of your revenue and a lot of your expense. Okay, so understand what your long-term picture looks like. That our tool can help you with that. There are other ways to do this analysis as well. But either way, know the trend and know what you need from your academic programs in order to get to whatever that goal is. And again, make sure that it's not just you who knows, but your entire cabinet knows, and your entire cabinet is ready to disseminate that message. Here's what a strategic academic planning process might produce in any given year. Okay, so it's going to produce a set of initiatives. Okay, so first of all, we're going to revise the schedule in these programs. We're going to say this is associated, the reason we're doing this is because it's associated with specific institutional goals. We're going to assign the Vice President for Academic Affairs to be the champion of this project. And our goal for revising the course schedule is to get our class sizes up so that we're using fewer adjuncts. Okay, that would be one sort of very concrete way to think about this. And of course, you have to attach timeline to that. Things when you're thinking about launching new programs, okay, we want to have our first class enrolled by 2026. All right, well, what are all the data that we have to support the sustainability and feasibility of getting a program launched that quickly? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start to take questions here. The final CPE question is here on your screen. I see a few questions coming in the chat, so I'll address those. We also have a kind of getting started slide that I want to make sure we cover, but let me go ahead and address this. There's one question, whether there are any examples or resources on program performance policies, maybe an article. This is a fleeting answer because every institution handles this differently, and it has a lot to do, frankly, with what the goals of the review are. I was just at the meeting of chief academic officers hosted by the Council of Independent Colleges over the weekend and heard a lot about this topic. And there's wide variability in this practice. I think some kind of rubric would be particularly helpful. But of course, in order to establish a rubric, you have to have consensus on those metrics that you're going to pull into the rubric in the first place. And then you also have to have consensus on what the use cases are. So let's say a program gets an F on your rubric, for lack of a better way to say it. What happens to that program? There has to be some clear policy around that as well. Okay. So some questions here about navigating the faculty conversation and sort of potential pushback from this sort of process. I will say that everything new, almost everything new is painful in the first year or two. But in our experience working with clients who have been doing this for several years, it's just part of the culture. So if you have a system in place that goes through the traditional governance structure, which is what we've advocated for here today, that is objective and defensible, and that you're faithfully adhering to those policies, you will get less pushback eventually. It will just become part of what people expect as part of their job and part of their contract, for lack of a better word, social contract for working with this institution. You know what is painful and what does produce really long-term resentment is an ad hoc program review, okay, where we say, all right, it's too late, we have to cut a third of you. That produces long-term resentment. this process whereby you're continuously evaluating your programs and giving struggling programs a runway so that you're actually sunsetting them rather than just ripping the program out of the sky, is more sustainable and will produce less pushback. And at the end of the day, it is about establishing a system people are comfortable working inside of clear policies. Okay. So another question here, are there existing or emerging disruptions? Should they be integral section of planning, budgeting, forecasting, and implementation? Can we identify particular indicators in this context in light of market research data or industry data research? I will follow up with you on that question. I just want to make sure I understand it a little bit better. I think the disruption could be one that works in favor of this process, in that I see a situation coming down relatively soon, and not because I have, any kind of like magic insight, but more just the industry has been trending in this way in some time. I think that accreditors are probably going to get a little bit more robust in their evaluation of institutions. And because accreditors' main charge is to make sure that an institution is delivering sound academic programs, I think that accreditors are probably going to become a little bit more reflective and prescriptive about what the program review process looks like. Now, that's not going to happen tomorrow. It might happen in 5 years. It might even not be their choice, as in there might be some regulations that come down from Department of Education or other regulatory agencies that impact what accreditors are charged with doing. But at the end of the day, I think that the industry regulators are going to require more evaluation and regular prioritization. And this is coming from a place where accreditors are already starting to be a little bit more prescriptive about what financial health looks like. Okay, so institutions are having to justify their financial position and having to indicate how they've sustained it. And that is going to come down to, at the end of the day, being a little bit more rigorous in the program review process. Okay? So I think that this kind of stuff is going to be going to move from strategic to required. Okay? So first off, in our 5 minutes left together, and then I'll leave you with some resources. Make sure you know what your academic vision is. Are you going to be the premier provider of healthcare focused programs in the Southwest? Are you already, and maybe you just don't know it? Are you going to be a top 50 ranked liberal arts college? There are challenges with that vision if you're not already one, but just as an example. Are you going to be known by employers in the Tri-County area for turning out graduates who excel in leadership positions? What is that vision? Okay. And it might not necessarily be reflected explicitly or clearly in your institution-wide strategic plan. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if it isn't, it probably should be. Okay. Study your position. Okay, so again, these are 4 things that you can start to do before you even kick off a planning process. Know your margins by program and their relationship with overall institutional health. Look at the enrollment funnel by program. Okay, again, application and yield data, and probably discount rate data by program as well. And understand what your opportunities are. That's the definition of strategy, is sort of looking forward to gain a long-term advantage. Okay. Convene a kickoff task force. Okay. This doesn't have to be the permanent strategic planning, academic planning committee, but this kickoff task force should be responsible for setting that institutional goal and defining and identifying those key metrics. Also, start developing the communication plan and the validation plan, right? So just going back to this question about how to manage faculty expectations through this process, strong communication is key to any change management initiative. Okay, people have to know the why, people have to know the how, and they really have to get behind that vision before they will really get on board with any kind of process like this. So just as you're filtering out today, thank you so much for joining us. I want to leave you with some of these resources. Most of our thought leadership, written thought leadership, comes through our foresight. So if you want to hear more from me and other authors working in our higher education audit and tax practices, please feel free to sign up for our foresights if you're not already. keep an eye out for the part 3 of this series, which will really dig into people and process to wrap around your strategic academic plan. And then finally, if you're interested in hearing more about this process of strategic academic planning or the tools that we showcased here today, feel free to reach out to me or go to the website here, the Program Economic Analysis website, and click the request information box. Have a lovely week, everyone. Weekend. We'll see you at the next one.